Jake Fisher, 28, had taken the night shift job to pay off his mounting debts. He worked alone most nights, loading and unloading containers at a remote dockyard. It wasn't glamorous, but the paycheck was steady. The dock was always quiet, too quiet. Tonight, the radios were down, and the wind off the water felt colder than usual. Jake didn't mind being alone, but something felt off. The flickering lights, the creaking of old metal containers, and the sound of the waves crashing against the pier created a tense atmosphere. As he walked through the maze of containers, his mind wandered. He thought about his father, a longshoreman like him, who had warned him about the dangers of working alone at night. Suddenly, he heard a faint noise like footsteps. His heart raced, but he convinced himself it was just the wind. He couldn't afford to lose focus. But then, the noise grew louder. Jake stopped, straining his ears to listen. The footsteps echoed louder, too steady to be the wind. He turned, his eyes scanning the shadows between the containers. Nothing. His pulse quickened as he continued toward the main gate, where Dan, the night security guard, should have been. Dan was 35, ex-military, and always serious about safety. He had a wife and 2 kids, and he often talked about them when they crossed paths. When Jake reached the gate, Dan was gone. His chair was empty, the security room door slightly open. Jake's stomach twisted. He knocked on the door, calling out, but no answer came. Maybe Dan had stepped out for a break. Jake tried to calm himself, but the silence felt heavy. He grabbed the radio from the desk and tried to call Dan, but all he got was static. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from behind him. Jake spun around, eyes wide. Someone, or something, was out there, and it was getting closer. Jake's heart pounded as he slowly backed away from the gate. The crash came from deeper within the dockyard, but the shadows made it impossible to see. He clenched his fists, remembering what Dan once said about always being ready. "You never know who's out there," Dan had warned him one night, eyes serious. Jake grabbed a wrench from the nearby toolbox. His hands shook, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford to panic. He thought about his mom, who'd always called him her strong boy. She worked 2 jobs to keep their home together, and Jake didn't want to let her down by running now. A scraping sound cut through the silence. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Someone was definitely following him. He darted between containers, trying to stay hidden, but every time he paused, the noise followed, closer, more deliberate. Then Jake saw him. A man in dark clothing, face half hidden under a hood. The man wasn't in a hurry. He knew Jake had nowhere to go. Jake's legs felt weak, but he forced himself to move. The man in the hood was closing in, his steps quickening. Jake sprinted through the maze of containers, his breath ragged. Every corner he turned, he hoped to lose the man, but the footsteps never stopped. They were getting louder, closer. His mind raced back to Dan. He always seemed unbreakable, never afraid of anything. "I've been through worse," Dan used to say, brushing off the night's dangers. But now Dan was missing, and Jake was all alone. He couldn't stop thinking about his mom waiting for him to come home. The sound of metal scraping on the ground made Jake look back. The man had picked up a crowbar, and his cold eyes locked onto Jake. The fear hit him harder now. Jake knew he wasn't just being chased. This man wanted him dead. He pushed himself harder, running toward the shipping office, his only chance of finding help. The office lights were still on, and it was just a few feet away. But would he make it in time? Jake burst through the door of the shipping office, slamming it behind him. His chest heaved as he locked the door and looked around. The room was empty except for an old desk and a phone. He grabbed the phone, his hands trembling, but there was no dial tone. His heart sank. No help was coming. Footsteps approached the door, slow and deliberate. Jake thought of Dan again, his friend who always seemed fearless. "If you panic, you lose," Dan had told him once, during one of their long night shifts. Jake couldn't panic now. The door rattled. The man was trying to get in. Jake grabbed a chair and wedged it under the handle, buying himself a few more moments. He needed a plan. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on a fire extinguisher in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was something. The door burst open, and the man stepped inside, crowbar raised. Without thinking, Jake rushed forward, spraying the extinguisher into the man's face. The sudden burst of white foam blinded him, and Jake seized the moment to knock the crowbar away. He didn't stop. For his mom, for Dan, for himself, Jake fought back. The man hit the floor, and the danger was over, but Jake knew his life would never be the same again. Before we get into the next story, if you're here for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. I need your support, so please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. Charlie Reynolds never thought cleaning would be this quiet. Briarwood Psychiatric Hospital had been shut down for over a year, but he'd been hired for a week-long contract to clean up the mess left behind. It was easy money, or so he thought. At 28, Charlie had bounced between jobs, construction, warehouses, you name it. Cleaning a hospital, especially one like Briarwood, seemed like a breeze. The first few hours were normal. He wiped down tables, swept halls, and listened to his headphones. But as the night wore on, something felt wrong. Rooms he'd just cleaned seemed disturbed. Chairs moved, doors cracked open. Then in room 107, he found it. A note scrawled in messy handwriting. "You missed a spot." He laughed it off, thinking it was left by the last janitor. But when whispers echoed through the empty hallways, his smile faded. Maybe this wasn't such an easy job after all. By the second night, Charlie was already on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was in the hospital with him. It was stupid, he thought. The place had been closed for months. No patients, no doctors. But when he found another note, this time in a freshly mopped hallway, it wasn't so easy to brush off. "You're not alone." Charlie had always been a practical guy. He didn't scare easy. Growing up in a rough neighborhood had taught him how to stand his ground. But something about Briarwood was different. His mind kept drifting back to his younger brother, Kyle, who had struggled with mental health before his passing. Charlie didn't like to think about it, but this place brought back memories. The whispering seemed louder now, like it was following him, but every time he turned around, there was nothing. His flashlight flickered and the halls felt colder. His hands shook as he cleaned, trying to focus on the job, but as he worked, he couldn't stop thinking, who was writing those notes? Charlie's third night started worse than the others. He had lost his master key, the one that opened every door in Briarwood. He was sure he'd clipped it to his belt when he started his shift, but now it was gone. As he retraced his steps, he couldn't help but feel watched. His mind wandered back to Kyle again. They were close growing up, but Kyle's mental health struggles had been tough on both of them. Charlie had always blamed himself for not doing more to help, and that guilt had followed him everywhere. It weighed on him here in this abandoned hospital full of painful memories. Walking down the dark hallway, Charlie noticed something strange. Room 107's door was ajar, the room he had locked earlier. Inside, the key was lying on the floor, and beside it, another note. "I've been waiting." His heart pounded as he picked up the key. The whispers were back, louder, almost like they were right behind him. Charlie wasn't alone, but whoever or whatever was with him wasn't friendly. By the fourth night, Charlie was exhausted. He hadn't been sleeping well since he started the job. The whispers and the notes were getting to him, reminding him too much of his brother's struggles. He couldn't help but feel some strange connection to this place, like it was trying to pull him in. Charlie decided to check the old patient files, hoping for some kind of answer. When he found the file for room 107, his blood ran cold. It belonged to a man named Ethan Kane, a patient who had never been discharged. The report said he had vanished on the night of the hospital's closure, but no one had seen him since. The last note in the file read, "He likes the janitor." His hands trembled as he left the office. The hospital was quiet, too quiet. When he reached room 107, the door was wide open. Inside, sitting on the freshly cleaned floor, was another note. "Come find me." Charlie's mind raced. Was Ethan still here? Was he the one leaving the notes? His flashlight flickered, and suddenly the whispers grew louder, more urgent. He wasn't alone, and he had to find out who or what was watching him. On the 5th night, Charlie had reached his limit. The whispers were louder, and the notes kept appearing, but this time there were footsteps too. He wasn't imagining things anymore. He had to confront whatever was lurking in the hospital. Charlie's thoughts drifted to Kyle, his younger brother. They had grown up together, but mental illness had driven a wedge between them. Charlie had always felt like he failed Kyle. And now, in this abandoned place, that same guilt seemed to haunt him more than the eerie noises. Maybe that's why he didn't quit. He needed to prove he could face this. Armed with his flashlight and nothing else, Charlie made his way to room 107. The door was closed. As he pushed it open, a figure stood in the middle of the room. Ethan Kane. Ethan's eyes were wild, his face gaunt. "I've been waiting," he whispered, his voice matching the one Charlie had been hearing. Charlie's heart pounded as Ethan stepped closer, holding a jagged piece of glass. For a moment, their eyes locked. In Ethan, Charlie saw the brokenness of his brother, but Ethan wasn't Kyle, and Charlie wasn't going to let this end the same way. He ran for the door, escaping, but the guilt still followed him. John had been working the night shift at the old warehouse for 2 years. At 34, he was used to the loneliness that came with the job, just him, the machines, and the silence. His wife hated the hours, but the pay was good, and it helped with the bills. Tonight felt no different. John sat in the break room, sipping his coffee, listening to the distant hum of the machines. His co-worker Gary was supposed to be around, but he hadn't seen him since clocking in. Gary was the warehouse's security guard, a guy in his early 50s, counting down the days until retirement. John shrugged it off. Gary was probably patrolling the perimeter, maybe out by the back gate where it was always darkest. Still, an uneasy feeling crept up on him. It was quieter than usual, almost too quiet. He checked his phone. No signal, typical for this place. He decided to find Gary, just to kill the boredom. As he stepped into the dimly lit corridor, a distant sound echoed. Footsteps. John's footsteps echoed softly in the long corridor as he searched for Gary. He didn't want to admit it, but something felt wrong. He kept thinking about his family, his wife, their 2-year-old daughter. They were the reason he worked these grueling night shifts, but tonight, a part of him wished he were home. He passed rows of silent machines, their hulking shadows making the warehouse feel more like a maze. As he reached the back gate, he noticed Gary's flashlight lying on the ground. It was still on, casting a faint beam into the darkness. That wasn't like Gary. He was careful, a man who'd been doing this job for years. "Gary?" John called out, but there was no answer. John's heart started to race as he picked up the flashlight. The air felt colder. He looked around, shining the light into the corners, but the shadows seemed endless. Then, from behind one of the machines came a low sound. Not footsteps this time. A scraping, dragging noise. His grip tightened on the flashlight. John's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced back to Gary's stories, the ones he'd laughed off. Gary always joked about how working night shifts messed with your head, how you'd start seeing things that weren't there. But this wasn't his imagination. "Gary?" He called again, this time more urgently. Slowly, he stepped toward the sound, his hands shaking. He turned the flashlight beam toward the source of the noise. Behind a large metal crate, he saw something that made his stomach drop, Gary's legs sticking out at an odd angle. John rushed over and knelt beside him. Gary wasn't moving. His eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. There was blood, too much blood, seeping from a deep cut in his side. John's mind screamed at him to run, but he was frozen in place. This wasn't supposed to happen. Gary had been a friend, always cracking jokes about his retirement countdown. Now he was gone, and John was alone in the warehouse. But as he stared at Gary's lifeless body, he knew one thing for sure. Whoever did this was still inside. John stumbled backward, his heart pounding. He couldn't stay here. Whoever had killed Gary could be anywhere. He remembered the old emergency exit on the other side of the warehouse. If he could get to it, he might have a chance. But as he stood up, he heard it again. That scraping sound, only now it was closer. John flicked off the flashlight, hoping the darkness would hide him. He crouched behind a crate, trying to steady his breathing. He thought about his daughter, how she'd just learned to say Daddy. He had to make it home to her. He had to survive this. The scraping grew louder, followed by the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. Whoever it was, they were moving through the warehouse, searching. John's mind raced. He needed a plan. Then he remembered the toolbox Gary always left by the back door. If he could reach it, maybe he could defend himself. The footsteps stopped. Silence. John strained his ears, listening, waiting. Suddenly, a metal tool clattered to the ground not far from him. His blood ran cold. They were close. Too close. John's heart raced as the footsteps drew closer. He knew this was his only chance. Silently, he moved toward the back door, every step careful, every sound amplified in the darkness. His mind was flooded with thoughts of his wife and daughter. He couldn't die here, not like this. As he reached the toolbox, he fumbled inside, his hands shaking. He found a wrench, heavy and solid. He clutched it tightly, his only defense. Just as he turned to leave, a figure appeared in the doorway. John froze. The man was tall, his face hidden by shadows, but John could feel the menace radiating from him. Without thinking, John swung the wrench as hard as he could. It connected with a sickening thud, and the man crumpled to the ground. John's heart pounded, his hands trembling. Was he dead? He didn't wait to find out. He bolted for the emergency exit, bursting into the cold night air. He ran and didn't stop until he reached his car. Shaking, he fumbled for his keys and sped away, the warehouse shrinking in his rearview mirror. John didn't know who the man was or why he had killed Gary, but he knew one thing. He was lucky to be alive.